Web forms and CGI scripts. Aims and objectives for this session then are to understand how the web works, to be able to create forms on HTML pages, to understand how CGI scripts can create pages and obtain data from forms, and to be able to write a CGI script to process data from a form. The idea of all this then is to be able to interact with web pages, to be able to upload data for the web server then to process those data in some way and to return a result. Now, there are a number of different ways of doing this, and we are going to concentrate on CGI scripts just because they're the most basic fundamental way of doing this. There are other approaches which may be simpler for certain tasks, but you can do everything using a CGI script. Part 1, the Internet and the web. The first thing to emphasize is the Internet and the web are not the same thing. The web is just one application of the Internet. So, as well as the web, in the bottom left here, we have FTP, which is File Transport Protocol. So you can often access this via a web browser, but it's a different protocol, a different way of transferring data, which is designed specifically for large files. We have news groups. These have largely died out now because the web allows the same sort of thing to happen in a more user-friendly environment. We have remote procedure calling. That allows us to access code or data running on somebody else's computer from within your programs or scripts, and we will come back to that in a future lecture. We have remote access, so things like SSH and Telnet, which allow us to access another computer and log into it. And we have email, of course. So let's look a little bit at how the web and how networking between computers works. Each computer has a unique IP address or Internet Protocol address. Now that's not necessarily quite true because often on something like a home network you will have a router which has a unique IP address which connects to the outside world, and that then accesses all the computers and devices that you have within your home network, and they don't have unique addresses that are seen by the outside world. They have this set of local addresses which is reserved for this particular purpose. So different people in different households will often be using the same address for their computers. But the router implements something called NAT, which is Network Address Translation, and that allows the outside world to see each of your computers through just one single address. So obviously an example of an IP address would be something like this. It's 4 numbers between 0 and 255, and they are separated by dots. But of course numbers are difficult to remember. So instead we use these hierarchical domain names, something like www.biochem.ucl.ac.uk. And names are then mapped to numbers using a kind of directory, like a phone directory, which is called the Domain Name Service. And the Domain Name Service, or DNS, is actually a distributed database of mappings, so that if one DNS server dies for some reason, then the information is available from other servers elsewhere. It also allows these data to be cached locally and cached at different levels of this hierarchical service, so that lookups don't all depend on one central resource. So what about the web? How does that work? The World Wide Web was developed to share text on documents on the same or different servers using hyperlinks, in other words clickable links, to allow you to jump from one document to another. Now, although we kind of think of the World Wide Web as being the start of doing this, actually there were a number of systems around before which did the same sort of thing, but they only really allowed the sharing of documents on a single server, or indeed on your actual local computer that you were using. So the difference with the web was that these hyperlinks could link between different computers and different servers. So what happens when you enter a URL into a web browser? Well, first of all, it has to connect to a DNS server in order to obtain the IP address. It's then able to connect to the web server, send a request for the page to that web server, and obtain the page back on the client from the server. So now we have our page on the client. The connection to the web server is then closed. The client scans the document for embedded images and that sort of thing, and repeats that connection and request for each embedded item, which eventually gets rendered on the screen. Now you can see this is quite an inefficient process, and in reality these days there are ways of keeping connections open and speeding this process up, but this is the fundamental way that things happen. Now, forms allow information to be sent to the web server for processing. So what we saw in that previous description was just obtaining static web pages. So in this case, what happens with a form is that the web server collects the information that went into the form and dispatches it to some sort of way of processing those data, and what we're going to focus on is these CGI scripts. So then the CGI script, or whatever other method we're using, outputs information to create a new web page which is returned via the web server to your web browser. So if we have our web browser talking to a web server and we send a request for a page, what we saw before with the static approach was that we have a set of pages stored on the web server and they get returned by the web server to the web browser. Now in this case, instead the web server is talking to a CGI script. The CGI script can extract parameters sent with the page request. That could then talk to something like a relational database or to external programs, and then format the data as an HTML page that goes back via the web server to the web browser. In that part of the lecture we have looked at the kind of fundamentals of what's going on, and in the second part we're going to look at what a CGI script actually is and how we can create forms on a web page in order to send data to the web server.